Our topic tonight is a wonderful one, the Clinton administration, the legacy of two administrations. Professor Perlmutter spoke to the Council in 1993, 7 years ago, at the very beginning of the administration, and gave what I thought was a very insightful and interesting presentation. And now, as we near the end of the Clinton years, it's an appropriate time, I think, to look at them. Not just because it's interesting to look back at 7 years, but we still are in a period of adjustment to the post-Cold War era. And so the thinking of the current administration is extraordinarily important with respect to our immediate directions. Professor Perlmutter is a very distinguished political scientist and sociologist. He received his degrees, his advanced degrees, from the University of California, Berkeley, but since then has had a most prolific career. He's the author of over 50 articles in very important journals. He's the publisher of 15 books, the author of 15 books, and he's contributed to other works. His immediate writings on current affairs appear in all of the major news media in the United States, as well as Germany, the United Kingdom, and Israel. And you probably have at one time or another seen him on one of his presentations over the electronic media, which is also comprehensive. In any case, the career represents two things: very serious, extended studies on one hand, and careful attention day by day to contemporary affairs as well. His areas of interest for which he's most known, although there are many, many areas on which he's an expert, but certainly the Middle East and Israel is something he's devoted a lot of attention to. Also to military and security studies, and certainly to international relations in general, and then to the questions of United States foreign and security policy. This should be a wonderful evening. I know I'm looking forward to it very much. It's my enormous pleasure to present to you Professor Amos Perlmutter.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, time goes swiftly, 7 years. How should one approach an American president, the first American president since Woodrow Wilson, who, during his campaign at the beginning of the administration, demonstrated total disinterest in foreign policy? You remember the president famous or infamous statement, "Is the economy stupid?" was Bill Clinton's line during the 1992 campaign, indicating that he didn't intend to be a foreign policy president. It seems at the time that international politics to the president meant the Cold War. And once the Cold War was over, international politics should be relegated and not preoccupy a president of the United States. Administration was going to be preoccupied with economics and social problems and intended to farm out America's global responsibilities to national and multilateral organizations, the UN, NGOs, and others, as foreign policy should not preoccupy an American president in the era of the post-Cold War. Therefore, this president, from the beginning, had no conceptual framework, a vision to pursue international politics. International politics and the international system is anarchic, unpredictable. But the only superpower, the only political, economic, diplomatic, and military power in the world after the Cold War was and is the United States. And no American president can escape this responsibility, and President Clinton did not escape it, but there was a certain price to be paid for failing to rein in the post-Cold War era. In fact, more than ever before, after the great victory, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the total demise of communism and its false utopia, it behooved upon the President of the United States or an American leadership to present, to think, to invent, to innovate an American strategic vision and policy, more than ever before. But that wasn't part of this president's cognitive mind or his orientations, nor with the stuff that he brought with him from one of the leading states in the Union, Arkansas. The consequences of the absence of a foreign policy, having no strategic center and a long-term geopolitical orientations, were that the administration threw its weight into too often strategically insignificant areas. Bosnia and Kosovo are strategically irrelevant to the United States. Even the Europeans, where these countries are at its back door, have not demonstrated great interest in Kosovo or certainly in the successive states of the disintegrating Yugoslavia. While his attention and political capital and military wherewithal was spent on peripheral areas from an American interest point of view, it conspicuously failed to deal with rogue states, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and of course, the important rivals of the United States, Russia and China. And it's obvious that there's no vacuum in international politics, like there's no vacuum anywhere, not even in space, as we know now from space scientists. It was going to catch up with the president. And instead of having a policy, a guideline, a way to walk through, you had to react to conditions and situations, which is at best not very useful in the long run for any country, especially for superpowers, foreign policy. The administration failed to connect the relationships between America's central front, Europe. Europe was and will continue to be central to the United States. We know that during World War II, there were efforts on the part of naval admirals to persuade President Roosevelt that China is more important than Europe. But it didn't work. In the end, it's a European, because of culture, history, strategy, and the rest, which remains the central point for an American foreign policy of any shape and form, whether it is an American foreign policy that is dedicated to unite Europe against international communism, or it is an America that is concerned with the end of Russia and the revolutionary demographic and political changes, remarkable ones, that took place in Europe itself. It's not only that the Russian Empire disintegrated. It's not only that the Eastern European Russian imperial rule has disintegrated, but the impact on Western Europe was nonetheless as important. And I think it was a failure of this administration, and it will continue to be, we'll discuss it later in the question of NATO, etc., to realize that we have a different Europe as well. That the Europe after the Cold War will not be taking the diktat from the United States. That the new European Union, which has emerged as the second most important economic power in the world, will not tolerate an American domination or NATO domination without role and participation. And we'll see in the issues of Kosovo, Bosnia, etc., how that demonstrated itself, the schisms and the fission that took place during that era. Not only that, but to see the connection between the new Europe or the post-war Europe and Russia, and the need that the administration of President Bush clearly understood to make Russia a European power, not only a democracy, a European power which is no less of importance. So, what did the administration do? Succumb to a policy that in the end distanced Russia from the United States, called NATO extension. The idea of extending NATO to Eastern Europe, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and as first batch, later it'll be the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Slovenia, you name it, will follow suit. The reasons for it were, first, domestic. In an election year, it's important to have the support of East Europeans in critical American cities. And the Polish lobby was powerful in its ability to influence the president electorally and otherwise. But besides the domestic issue, it was the idea, since you don't have an idea, you have to borrow an idea, it was a European idea as well, that you have to extend NATO to make sure that NATO is intact, and then we continue to have the linkage with Europe, i.e. domination of Europe. We call it linkage. In fact, it was Henry Kissinger who was very upset with NATO extension's failures, saying, well, we got to tell the Europeans what to do, because they on their own don't know always what to do. I'm quoting him, paraphrasing him a little bit. But the point was that if we strengthen NATO and extend it to Eastern Europe, we accomplish the following. First, we are still in command of NATO. Second, we extend democracy, freedom to all these East European states. That was phony. Why? Because the only way you can extend democracy and economic development to Eastern Europe is to have them join the European Union. And the European Union is unwilling to accept them because they are afraid of Polish workers, Hungarians, and the rest. And they are not willing to pay the money and to bring the East Europeans to the level. So this argument actually was a phony argument by the administration that we are extending, freedom to people who have not known it since 1919. That was not true, because European Union is the area where the East Europeans could find their answer. They don't need more weapons. They need more schools, more roads, more transportation, more education. I can give you a whole list of what they need. The European Union is not very generous in that area. So the NATO extension was an effort to do two things. One, to bring the Europeans together, to make the Eastern Europeans happy, said, all right, we fought for your independence. That was the Cold War, what it was about. And now, look what we do. We extend NATO to you. Now, it is the first time in human history that I know that an alliance is organized against an unknown enemy. Usually alliances have to have a target, a rival, an opponent, an enemy. No one could mention that NATO extension means bringing NATO to the borders of Russia. So while you, President and his advisors, advocate democratization of Russia, you advocate the arms control in Russia, the destruction of nuclear weapons, bringing Russia to Europe. Instead, you are extending NATO to Russia. And to the Russians, NATO is a dirty word. Because they remember NATO as a central military alliance that was designated against the Soviet Union or Russia. So you succeeded to alienate and to disrupt the very policy that you were dedicated to in bringing Russia to your fold. In fact, more than that, President Bush and his advisors, to make sure that Gorbachev will accept the independence of East Germany and a united Germany in NATO. You have to understand, a united Germany in NATO, if Stalin would have held it, he would emerge from his grave to undo it. Yet Gorbachev was willing to accept it, and there were 8 principles that the Bush administration signed with Gorbachev as a price for the unification of Germany in NATO. By the way, Helmut Kohl was ready to have unification without NATO because he was so desperate for unification, wanting to be the other Bismarck. And in one of the principles, it was written that no NATO forces will go beyond the borders of NATO today, that means before extension. So we violated an international understanding with the Russians. We have created conditions whereby we are distancing ourselves from having an impact on the development of Russian-American relationships. So that's what happened in Europe. We can go on into other areas as well. And now we have to go into NATO, the next step of NATO, NATO extension into Bosnia and NATO extension into Kosovo. It's not called like that, but that's what it is. Now, Bosnia. Bosnia was easy. Why was it easy? Because there were 3 presidents. The Serb state, the Croat Muslim state, were willing to accept the partition of Bosnia. So you can send American NATO troops as well as European NATO troops to more or less a safe haven in Bosnia because all were more or less satisfied with the division. And the division has been legitimized by the very presidents who were at loggerheads with one another on Bosnia. And therefore, Richard Holbrooke was very successful in his Dayton agreement and Dayton policy. It was successful because there was a legitimate understanding between all the 3 that they'll get American support, that each one will have their own state, however diminished, and that they will eventually become part of NATO extension, of course. What else? This model was so successful that the successor to the next Secretary of State, Mrs. Albright, thought that the same thing could be done in Kosovo as well. After all, here's a perfect situation. The Serb Milosevic thug massacre and brutalities over Albanians. What could be a better combination for Clinton humanitarian understanding and policy than we will fight to bring an end to Milosevic's atrocities? And of course, like in Bosnia, we will create a multi-ethnic state, and everybody is going to be happy, with the exception that all the parties were not consulted, with the exception that the Albanians that Mrs. Albright took the Albanian side. A whole policy was based upon rejection of Mr. Milosevic and the Serbs, and that we never, ever admitted that Yugoslavia, that Serbia, has no longer sovereignty over Kosovo. So can you imagine the mess? Here you got a country that is dominated now by NATO, who supposedly is still part of Serbia. But Serbia is the enemy, and we disarm and later arm an Albanian radical force who are dedicated only to one thing: to bring an end to Serb control over Kosovo and establish an independent Kosovo, of which the administration and Mrs. Albright never accepted an independent Kosovo, nor accepted a Serbian domination of Kosovo. And I'll say a few words later what are the consequences we are facing every day today, and more so. Furthermore, Kosovo demonstrated that NATO already served its purpose in the Cold War, that NATO no longer is the NATO we have known. It is no secret, and the American generals admitted, and soon enough they'll write books about it, that the schism within NATO over the Kosovo war were monumental. The French wanted to go their way. The Greeks and Italians wanted to go their way. Tony Blair thought that there's an opportunity to bring himself closer to the American side and to split the French-German historical alliance that was buttressed by Kohl and Mitterrand, all in one act. Mr. Blair told all of us the policy in Kosovo is the Serbs out, we in, the refugees back. The Serbs are not out, they're waiting in the northeastern corner. We are not exactly in because we cannot handle the turnover of atrocities now that the Albanians against the Serbs, because we believe in a multi-ethnic state. And third, not all the refugees come back because they're afraid, rightly so, that another conflagration will take place in Kosovo. So Kosovo demonstrated the futility of NATO as we have known it. And furthermore, Europeans have decided that since we fought a 21st century war in Kosovo and they fought a 19th century war, they need a European military force, independent from NATO, but it will not disrupt with NATO. This is total nonsense, because the European countries are reducing their defense budgets, downgrading their defense forces. How could they establish an American-style or semi-American style 20th century type of alliance, military alliance? It's out of the question. So we now have created schisms within NATO and between us and NATO. But that's not all. Now the Russians. You have to realize that the reason why Milosevic finally accepted, after 78 days of destruction, the deal was because the Russian intelligence, with whom he's in contact, came and told him, look, Slobodan, we will not support you if you don't bring an end to that war. And Chernomyrdin, the former Prime Minister of Russia, was very active in it. And we created a Finnish ambassador to finish the business, because without the Russian support, the Finnish ambassador would have no foundation for negotiation. But then the Putin regime, will the historian of the future say, has emerged as a consequence of NATO extension and especially of Kosovo. The humiliation of the Russian troops, instead of giving them a zone in Kosovo, they had to capture the airport. And luckily enough, we didn't go to war against them to get them out of the airport. You can imagine only this? Going to war against the Russians? For what purpose? And the humiliated Russian military has decided enough is enough. Putin will establish a central authoritarian, not Bolshevik government, no Bolshevik, not totalitarian. He's ready to deal with the West. He's ready to deal with NATO. Why not? Stealing information from NATO is a wonderful thing. They've been doing it for some time. Now they have the offices in NATO, so they don't have even to have spies. They are just there to get all the information. But Mr. Putin will not, and his military will not accept anymore another humiliation. That's over. So the end of Kosovo is that for an insignificant politically and strategic area, we have created schisms between us and NATO and demonstrated what was there, but it wasn't apparent, the division among NATO allies. We have alienated the Russians, and we bombed the Chinese as well, to boot. Well, that was I'm accepting it as an intelligence failure, and I know how many people would like to have that as a conspiracy. Actually, we did it. Don't give this administration that much credit to have conspiratorial visions, because you have to have 3 moves at the same time. That's a bit too much for any foreign policy maker, especially of a great power, not only of this administration. It's very difficult, you know. I can assure you, historically. Conspiracies can take place in the family, among corporate groups, but not when it comes to state. There are too many bureaucrats who hate one another, who compete with one another, who will undo a conspiracy the moment it begins. All military coups in the Middle East were made by 4 or 5 people, because once 10 officers are in the deal, forget about the conspiracy. Conspiracy is a conspiracy. Therefore, I don't buy that. Anyway, which brings us to China. So a humanitarian foreign policy created in Kosovo the opposite conditions. We have replaced one atrocity makers with another atrocity makers. Even if it's not equal, there's no question about it. But above all, General Clark and General Short, which I saw on BBC a week ago, it's a fantastic program. I hope it's going to come to this country on the war in Kosovo. Clearly said, unabashedly said, that the NATO bombing has increased and exacerbated the refugee problems. Well, Milosevic himself promised General Clark that's going to happen if you go to war against us, I assure you I'm going to kick all of them out in my way. And they know Milosevic's gentle ways. So to say that we went to war to bring an end to the violence and to tragedy of Kosovo is a patent lie. If it is done naively, you can forgive naive people, although Machiavelli would say that in politics you don't forgive people who are naive. You don't make mistakes in politics, you have to pay a price for it. But this, and let's bring us to China. There, the administration demonstrated its half-heart, the beginning and the end of it. The beginning of it is Wilsonian, idealistic, that we're going to create, walls, say, for democracy. There'll be more democratic states. The Cold War has brought an end to all the atrocities, like Woodrow Wilson believing, that once the empires have gone, once the military cabals have disappeared, all the people will become democratic. Like, for instance, only one state in Austria-Hungarian Empire that was dissolved became democratic. That was Czechoslovakia. And this and Yugoslavia, the two states that he created, collapsed as soon as the tyrannical rule was over. The only multinational states in Eastern Europe are those dominated by monarchies or tyrannies, whether it's a historical monarchy or a Soviet style of tyranny or fascist style of tyranny. Remember what the Nazis did in Croatia and other places, in Slovenia. So we decided that we're going to go now half tea, half coffee. One, we're going to have a humanitarian policy toward China. We're going to make sure, that we're going to condemn the Chinese for their failure to come to terms with the atrocious policy of oppressing minorities and of Stalinist type of totalitarianism. On the other hand, we want the Chinese to join the World Trade Organization. We'll give them the carrot. So the stick will be humanitarianism, the carrot will be World Trade Organization, but the stick, the Chinese laughed at and ignored. The carrot, they cannot get because Congress is not dying to give it to them. And in view of the Taiwan policy and the new government in Taiwan, it'll be much more difficult for any administration to put the act together. The one China policy, as we have known him, is over. Now, what it'll be is a different matter, and not for me to predict. Now, having said all that, about India and then India, I'm very glad that I came here today and not yesterday, because I was going to tell you yesterday that the fanatic policy of non-proliferation will damage our trip to India. Open the paper today and see what Prime Minister Vajpayee and President Narayanan told Clinton as is. After Mrs. Albright likes to tell things as is, well, the Indians are telling us also as is. Listen, man, we're going to have nuclear weapons, and we will help you with proliferation. But I'm sorry, Mr. President, don't talk to us about Kashmir, because we don't want you to negotiate. You already did something which was not very successful on Kargil. In the end, the Pakistani, your allies betrayed. And either you make us part of the nuclear club, of the 5 elite nuclear club, then we can talk, or we will take care of the proliferation. We have no intention, as said the Prime Minister of India said, we have no intention, to do another nuclear explosive. Why do we have to do that? But, Mr. President, don't preach to us about non-proliferation. Now, one of the early, most consistent, fanatical, determined policies of this administration is non-proliferation. And so, in Russia, we've done our best to arrest some of this policy that was already begun with President Bush. And in India, we have failed completely to explain to the Indians. And we should have done it 3 or 4 years ago. He should have gone to India 3 or 4 years ago and tried to persuade the government. His administration should read the elections in India as a Hindu nationalist force in India. They were wrong also in Taiwan. Oh, all the press that is fed by Washington. I live in Washington, and I can tell you, the press, even the New York Times, is fed by Washington. Remember, they told us, oh, there'll be 3 forces in Taiwan. That was fed by the administration. Well, there was one force. The Taiwanese, after 50 years, got rid of John Kashek and company. I thought it was funny that Madame Zhang, who is 104 years old, signed on behalf of the Taiwan vice president then. And somebody asked, can she still write at the age of 104? Anyway, I don't think that her signature was very helpful. Now, so what did the administration do that is right? After all, it's not possible that all is wrong. And why did the administration face all these difficulties? Some of their own and some not of their own. I didn't talk about the CTBT, you know, the nuclear test ban treaty, because that's too detailed, but if you want to, I'll talk about it. What can be said in defense of this president? And there's much to say. After 1994, he faced one of the most recalcitrant Republican anti-international congresses. In some sense, one can say almost isolationist Congress, or neo-isolationist, making it very difficult for him to initiate aggressive foreign policy. And remember, he was a minority president. He didn't win decisively so that he could, you know, dictate to Congress, and you know that it's not easy to dictate to Congress. Even a master brilliant politician, and none since FDR have we had such a brilliant politician, not statesman, I say politician, was unable to persuade a Republican majority in Congress. In the area of free trade, with the help of the Republicans, he succeeded with NAFTA. He is a free trader, an honest free trader, and a good free trader. And in that area, no one could fault or should fault him, and he succeeded in that. Another issue which I think I mentioned at the beginning, but the other side of it is, with the end of Cold War, American people lost interest in foreign policy. It's hard to mobilize the American people on an issue. There is no clear enemy. There is no clear movement. There is no clear force that can threaten us with nuclear weapons. There's no communism to mobilize. And that, of course, is significant. It's significant that America's unrivaled, the paradox is that America's unrivaled strategic position has paradoxical implications for the conduct of foreign policy. While it gives the US tremendous freedom of action on one hand, it restricts its ability to deal with issues because of the apathy of its citizens. A 1998 survey of the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, asking Americans to name 2 or 3 problems facing the country today, and foreign policy was not even mentioned. It's education, health. Foreign policy is not an issue of interest to the American people. A question to identify 2 or 3 foreign policy problems was answered by 21%, I don't know. support for military spending, foreign aid, and multilateral institutions declined in the 1980s. Even commitment to such firm allies of the United States as Israel, Taiwan, and South Korea has declined considerably. And that is not the president's doing, but a man with imagination. Would he be a real Woodrow Wilson? I imagine he would have succeeded, if not with the Republican Congress, to educate the American people in foreign policy. You don't send Mrs. Albright to educate the American foreign policy to the American people. You have to do it with a bully pulpit. You got to do it the Teddy Roosevelt way, the FDR way, the Truman way, the Eisenhower way, the Nixon and others. You have to educate the people on foreign policy. People live with education, live with social issues, with welfare and economic problems. They don't live with foreign policy. Some do, but there's a very small group that deals, that lives with foreign policy, that has an interest in foreign policy. There may be no more than this group here that really is interested in all this area in foreign policy. I admired it. I thought I'm going to have 20 people around here, but certainly you demonstrated to the country. But you don't represent the average American citizen and his or her concern with foreign policy. Now, in conclusion, I would say the following. President Clinton will not enter the pantheon of great internationalists, conservative realists, and strategists like Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan. He certainly will join the other international idealist presidents, Jefferson and Wilson, but they demonstrated greater skill, perspicacity, historical and intellectual depth, and an understanding of international affairs. And this is, I think, the tragedy of foreign policy President Bill Clinton. I didn't say things about the Middle East simply because it was there. The Arabs and Israelis are ready to make a deal. The question is, what kind of a deal? You don't need an American president to punish one or another to make a deal. They are ready. Sooner or later, in one way or another, Palestine issue, Syrian issue, others. Saddam Hussein is at large, Milosevic is at large, the Ayatollahs are still at large. They already defied Mrs. Albright's offer for better understanding. And it will be left for the next president to deal with the most important issues of American foreign policy. Some argue they will not do much better. We'll see. Thank you.
Well, we thank you for covering an enormous challenge so well and so clearly. The floor is now open for questions.
If you are the President of the United States today, coming back from India and Pakistan and stopping in Switzerland and meeting with President Assad, what would you tell the Syrian president, and consequently, what do you tell the Israeli Prime Minister that will make both of them make peace in the Middle East, lasting peace?
Good. First, there's very little to tell both of them. All the issues are clear. Every issue has been hammered out for the last 6 years. Every issue has been hammered. The question is, what are the red lines for one or another? Is the Syrians happy with just withdrawal from the Golan Heights, or do they want Israel to give up some waters in the Jordan River and the Lake of Galilee? Will they create a regime which they prefer not to call normalization, normalcy? I have great difficulties with the president of Syria who wants to have good relations with Israel, or at least bring an end to the conflict, whose propaganda machine talks about Israel, a Nazi state, 1/3 of every Israeli citizen, either old generation or second generation, are survivors. Second, what do you tell the president of Syria that in this meeting in Geneva, he will allow Israeli reporters and journalists to be in the press conference? The last time he said no. He told Clinton, no press conference with Israeli journalists. Now, how can you appeal to the Israeli people? Without an appeal to them, there will be no peace. Without meeting in four eyes with Barak, there will not be peace because a referendum will not go through. I think at the moment, Israel has come forward in many, many ways that it has not before. After all, Barak was admitting that Rabin made a statement that Israel will go down from the Golan Heights. The only gleam of hope I have is, and I told Frank about it, the three actors in the Middle East, Arafat, Barak, and Assad. No, there's only one man that can bring upon a deal, that's Bill Clinton. The only area in the world which Bill Clinton is popular is in the Middle East. By the way, Nixon was also popular for different reasons. So, it doesn't augur very well. But no question, they know that the next president, even if it's going to be Gore, will try to continue the policy. And certainly not Bush, who's unpredictable so far as they're concerned, will be able to bring an end to the conflict. There's a young generation in Syria that is craving, for freedom, for the information revolution. You cannot have, an internet which is open and closed. Like little children who cannot see dirty movies, Syrian intellectuals cannot read Israeli press. That attitude has to change. Let me tell you, the Sadat success was that he came to Jerusalem and said, I'm here, and I am going to have peace with you if you give me all the territory back. There is no serious contention between Israel and Syria. Nothing serious. It's psychological. A breakthrough must take place, and I put the onus and responsibility upon Assad, whose foreign minister comes to Shepherdstown a few months ago, doesn't want to talk to Israeli partners, doesn't want the Israeli press to be when he is around. What kind of thing is this? This was good for 20, 30 years ago. When I was at the UN and some Arab diplomat recognized me, he ran away. What am I? Suffering from some disease? It's got to be over. That's the problem. I hope that President Clinton will tell more or less to Assad what he has to tell him. Listen, buddy, I have only a few months left. You want it or you don't want it? And he's taken Barak's position. You got to appeal to the Israeli people. You got to open your heart, your television, your radio. Well, we'll see. But I don't think that it is insurmountable.
Earlier in your discussion, you had indicated that China as a rival to the United States.
Yes.
A recent article in Foreign Affairs said the same thing, that the American perception is it's a rival. However, militarily, politically, and economically, they are in fact at best a nuisance to the United States. Do you feel that they are a rival or a nuisance, and why?
Right. Well, I when I speak about a rival, I don't speak about today. In a decade or two decades, China is going to be one of the most significant Asian powers, an Asian military power. Their attitude toward Taiwan was unreasonable, foolish in many ways. It was counterproductive. It went against them. They are now lowering the level of aspirations. I'm concerned with the future of Taiwan, not in the sense of Taiwan as such, but Taiwan is a model for me of Chinese expansionism or non-expansionism. And therefore, whether it is economically and politically and militarily poor, so is Serbia. And they fought 78 days without quite successfully. So the measurement cannot be just on weapons. The measurement has to be in terms of what will they be and how we're going to harness them now. I think we have to end the appeasement policy of China that took place from Kissinger till now. At that time, it was a brilliant card against the Soviet Union, to play the China card. The Soviet Union doesn't exist, and we have to play a different China policy. China now is a more serious rival, and therefore I believe we have to establish excellent relationship with the countries surrounding China, India, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines, etc. And so we don't have the demography. You see, a revolution in international politics took place in '89. It's not just, the end of the Soviet Union. It impacted every area in the world. So we played the China card because we wanted to put Russia in its place. We wanted to bring an end to the Vietnam War. Of course, we lost because we didn't understand that the Chinese and Vietnamese have no love for one another. But today, we have to look upon differently. I think that appeasing China, I'm in favor of China being part of WTO, but they're going to pay a price for it. They're going to make certain conditions, statements, and get off the Taiwan bashing policy, which only helped the Taiwanese new president election. It turned against them. They misread. They are our next neighbors to Taiwan. There are 30 million Chinese or more who are working in China. There's no question that there will be some sort of a reconciliation. But remember, the East Germans are still not completely Germans. How do you want the Taiwanese to be completely Chinese? It takes a long time for that to happen. Remember, 50 years is 2 or 3 generations. But I am, for the time being, supporting a policy of rivalry and not partnership. Now, trade, they need us, as Paul Wolfowitz said, they need us more than we need them. Well, let's play the game. They need us more than we need them. They crave for our goods more than they crave for the European goods. So if somebody said, oh, well, if we're not going to do business there, the Europeans will do. Пожалуйста, let the Europeans sell them, especially not military equipment, which there's only one place to buy military equipment in the world that is of any value, asking Europeans, after Kosovo, is the United States. That doesn't mean that we have to be antagonistic to them. But we have to tell them, you know what? We want a different attitude. I think we'll get it if we do it.
How should the United States and Western Europe be dealing with Russia in Chechnya regarding the Chechnya situation?
I believe that we shouldn't let Putin off the hook. Chechnya is an atrocity, and you and I know that we have no way to bring upon a humanitarian policy in Chechnya. The American people will not be ready for it, NATO is not ready for it, and the rest. It's very unfortunate. Could we have prevented it? No. No. See, the disintegration of the Soviet Union And the disintegration within the Soviet Union is an ongoing process. There's Dagestan, there's, Azerbaijan, there are so many problems. And Chechnya is part of the pride, part of the historical role, and are not very delicate and sophisticated in dealing with some of their people. They could have played games between different types of Chechnyans. Our function is to condemn it, but to do nothing about it, because we cannot do anything about it. But we have to condemn it. We have to hunt once Putin is president. We have to secure a price for Chechnya from him in terms of International Monetary Fund, etc. It's the only time that only time maybe Sharon will tell me otherwise, that I agree with Zbigniew Brzezinski, since I've known him at Harvard. It's a great achievement on his part that I agreed with him on the question of Chechnya. But that's all. The rest, we don't see eye to eye on anything. So you're right, Chechnya we have to condemn it. And we haven't done enough, and the Europeans obviously haven't done enough, the Germans especially, because they have Russia as a trade partner. They don't want to alienate it.
This has been a splendid evening, Professor Perlmutter. We've covered an awful lot of ground, and your observations are insightful. There's a lot of depth, and we're grateful to you for coming with us this evening.
Thank you.